Thank you very much. And thanks to Peggy for inviting me along to talk about one of my interests, which is ethics in internet mediated research. Well, first let me say what I mean by internet mediated research. I'm referring to primary data collection online. So gathering data using online surveys, observation approaches, and so on, not secondary research. And so research that involves gathering data to generate new conclusions about new research questions, basically, rather than literature searching and that kind of thing. And just to give you some background, I just recently convened a working party for the BPS, the British Psychological Society, to develop guidelines for ethics in internet research, because as many of you will know if you sit on ethics committees, more and more applications are coming in which propose using these online data collection methods. And there are lots of sticky sort of areas and issues that people aren't quite sure how to deal with. And in my ethics committee work at the Open University, we've come across these. And so the BPS, in fact, originally developed some guidelines. I think it was in 1997 I was involved in that, but things move on very quickly in this area, and it was felt that they do need updating. So I've just been involved in doing that, and I want to give you some of the main insights that came out of that discussion and mention some of the key points that we've actually covered in those guidelines. So they're based on psychological research essentially, but it's a very broad field of psychology, and a lot of the points will be applicable to many other disciplines. So I want to give you a quick, just brief overview of internet mediated research and what I mean by this and the diversity of methods involved. So, state of the art. Well, obtrusive methods, it's useful to distinguish between obtrusive and unobtrusive methods in this area. So questionnaires, experiments, interviews, focus groups, anything where you actually actively recruit participants and they knowingly partake and generate data with you. Unobtrusive methods, now these are, I think there's been a big development lately in the use of unobtrusive methods, and people are aware of the term big data, no doubt, which is quite a hot topic at the moment. So these are methods where we go in and gather data without the participants' awareness, those that are contributing data's awareness. So observation techniques where you go and gather linguistic data, for example, from discussion groups, look at the way people interact online. Data mining is a term that's been used, web crawling, and basically we could actually see internet-mediated research now as having hit a new era due to the development of Web 2 technologies. And Web 2 is a term I'm sure people will probably be familiar with. So this is the idea of the web as an organic, collaborative, interactive, changing space where people interact with each other rather than just placing static documents online. Okay. Clearly as well, an important point in relation to internet-mediated research is that the internet is becoming more and more permeated into everyday lives of more and more people. So the internet user population is expanding massively, and these are some of the things that people are currently using the internet for. So the actual potential to access participants in this way is expanding at a massive rate. So this creates an awful lot of data that's just there, available for us to access and use in unobtrusive research, but also a massive user population who's there and available potentially as research participants. It's been referred to that the traces that people leave every day during their interactions with the internet have been referred to as digital breadcrumbs of everyday contemporary life. So the point really is that there's so much data there, and certainly psychologists, I think, are amongst those that are kind of leading the way in exploring how this data can be used. But sociologists certainly are have interest in big data. So it's becoming more and more pressing to think about ethics issues in relation to these methods. Okay. Well, I've got some links there. I'm not going to be able to demonstrate anything, partly from time constraints, and I don't think I can anyway. But this is going to be, I think, made available afterwards. So I've just got some examples of places online where you can actually access potential research data, where people have accessed data using these resources. So discussion forums, I mentioned Yahoo groups, that allows you to search from a range of discussion groups to access all sorts of discussions on various topics. There's online communities. Mumsnet is a well-known, very large community now which has blogs, advice, columns, many discussion forums on different topics, blogs, and if we're thinking more about unobtrusive data collection, then things like Google searches, web browsing activity, online purchases that have been made by people, links in social networks, who friends who, and so on and so forth. Those kind of things are all potential data for unobtrusive research approaches. Okay, this is an example of what you might call big data. You can try and guess what it is. You probably won't have much luck. It's from a website which presents many networks like this that people have generated. This actually comes from Nike Plus app, an app for your smartphone. And this is linked to a shoe that Nike sells, which involves having a sensor embedded within it. And what that allows you to do, if you're into running, I've actually tried it out, I've recently started running myself, is to collect data about where you run. So it uses geolocation information and collects data. And then you can upload that to a social media running site and compete with your friends and show where you've been and whatever. So this image here shows a year's worth of runs uploaded to the website in, I think this is New York, this image here, but this has been constructed for the New York, London and Tokyo. And you can actually play back this and see where people have run. So that's an example of how the internet can generate big data, right? And use that. It's not perhaps a very psychological example, but other examples certainly are. So what about ethics issues when we're trying to do this type of research then? Okay. I think the key point is that what we want to do, obviously, is take our standard ethics principles and guidelines for our discipline that we're working within and apply these when we adhere to these when we're doing online research. And the key point here is that some of these issues will require special consideration because complexities emerge when we move to online data collection in ways that they don't arise offline for various reasons. So this is a key point, and these might not always be obvious to researchers, these issues. So an unwitting researcher might be going, to do an online survey and just not appreciate some of these issues. This is one of the main purposes of these guidelines, is to just highlight some of the basic things that need consideration, which people might not find obviously issues. So there's just a few things: data security, and Joe mentioned data protection, and that's all relevant and resonates with some of the points I'm going to make. Traceability is a key one. The traceability of the data that we're using, and the potential to locate this in ways that you might not, probably can't with offline data so readily. And I'm going to go through some of the key issues here and try and just say basically why they're issues. And the guidelines really are more about how to think about these issues and giving hard and fast rules about what you should or shouldn't do, which, as you can imagine, is not easy to come up with those types of rules. So I'm talking about the BPS guidelines, but as I said, they're more broadly applicable to other disciplines. The emphasis is on how to apply existing ethics principles to the online medium, though some new issues do arise. And this is the kind of mantra that we came up after all of our discussions. We had quite a bit of disagreement within the group, and then in the end, we just agreed that every different research project is a different context and has different factors and will need different solutions, basically. So thinking is not optional. That's in the document, as you cannot just apply rules such as, I don't know, if you don't need a password to access something, then it's in the public domain, therefore it's usable. That doesn't really work in this context. So the guidelines are centred around these principles, which are the key principles of the British Psychological Society from the Code of Human Research Ethics, the main ethics document. Respect for the autonomy and dignity of persons, scientific value, social responsibility, and maximising benefits and minimising harm. So we focused very much on those core principles when we were developing these guidelines. Okay, throughout our consideration of these issues and how they apply in an online data collection context, we did bear in mind this key principle about online data collection, which is it involves the acquisition of data without face-to-face presence with individuals. Okay, well, I mean Skype, you would have video technologies that allow you to perhaps see someone, but in general, we're collecting data from individuals without being co-present with them. And this isn't unique to online data collection methods. Obviously, postal surveys involve these aspects as well. However, the key point about online data collection is that many of the procedures, for example, experimental designs, and interview-based research as well, allow much greater scope for carrying out more interactive, complex procedures than a postal survey, for example, where you haven't got face-to-face interaction. So these two key features combine together to raise some interesting issues, really. The traceability of online data is something that came up as key. I'll say more about that as I talk on the other topics, I think. I'm not sure all these points are coming up, but anyway. So these are the main issues that we came up with that need particular special consideration. The public-private domain distinction is highly controversial. People disagree on this. People have very different opinions on which data you can and can't use, when you can and can't use it. Confidentiality, maintaining confidentiality through anonymity of participants becomes problematic in many contexts. Copyright emerges as an issue. Who owns the data that you might be able to get access to online? Consent, withdrawal and debrief, those kind of combine together and are more relevant to obtrusive approaches, obviously, but they do raise certain difficulties in online data collection contexts. Levels of control, clearly if you're not face-to-face with your participants, you have reduced levels of control, and that has various implications for, well, various ethics points. And one of the key things that the main BPS guidelines highlights as a principle is to be careful about disrupting social structures, and online communities are social structures as well, so we need to think about how we might be disrupting those by the research that we might want to do. Okay, so this is a principle that comes from the Code of Ethics and Conduct, a BPS document, and it states that observation of public behaviour should only occur where those observed would expect to be observed by strangers. So what we were doing with these guidelines, as I said, was taking the core principles that have been established and looking at how these apply in an online environment. So this raises the issue, and this is why people have disagreed so much on this. What are people's expectations in online contexts? Well, it's difficult to know at this stage. It really is. We haven't got a really clear indication of what people's expectations are in many different contexts, and clearly research is needed on that. So this leads to the issue of the public and private domain distinction becoming increasingly blurred online. I mean, it can be blurred offline, clearly, but online we're just less familiar with these contexts and what people's expectations are, so it becomes a pretty difficult issue. And I'm focusing here on quite sort of practical, sort of more local issues that previous speakers have talked about, broader concerns, so I've got some concrete examples of studies here. This one by Hewson and Bruckman, they were interested in how people would respond to being asked to take part in an online observation study, actually. So this is about whether we need to obtain informed consent, which is one of the major issues with the public-private domain distinction. So what Hewson and Bruckman did was they went into chat rooms and they asked to record discussions. So that's one of the methods that people might want to use, and that people have used. Many psychologists have used these methods. They went in and they wanted to find out what people's reactions were, so they did a controlled experiment on this topic. And they had a few different conditions, but a main one was that they compared going in and lurking, so that means jumping into the chat room and just hanging in there and observing without saying anything, or asking to record their discussions. And they were interested in what responses they got to these two different conditions. So in both cases, they did actually receive quite hostile responses, and they were kicked out. But interestingly, and they draw implications from this, they were kicked out less when just lurking. So they came in and politely asked, can we observe your discussion, is that okay? They also had various other different conditions, such as you can opt in or you can opt out, and there were variations there. But this is a key distinction because it led to their conclusion that just lurking might be the best thing for us to do as researchers, and asking for consent isn't a great idea because people don't want us to observe them. So that's clearly contentious conclusion to draw, and it does relate to scientific validity of research and so on. But I think why this is interesting, the researchers have very, very different experiences where participants have been willing and quite happy to engage with the research. And this is the message they put in the chat room in this particular study. We're researchers recording this chat room for a study on language use in online environments. For questions or comments, email this address. Thank you. That was it. So it's not very surprising that they got this kind of hostile reactions that they did. Qualitative researchers such as Madge and O'Connor have run focus groups and interviews, for example, and observation studies, and they've done all how you should do these things properly if you're a qualitative researcher. So they've engaged with participants and built up rapport with them and that kind of thing, and they've been very successful studies. But yes, this is quite an interesting attempt to look at these issues. I want to mention these two studies as well because they contrast quite nicely. This is well, the first one, Brodsky and Giles, they were interested in looking at anorexia, and particularly pro-anorexia websites. And what they did, they decided that disclosing the research to these users of these websites was not appropriate or wise. And so what one of the researchers did was get to know one of the websites in detail by observing, lurking and observing, and then posed as a plausible user of the website, a persona, and went in and gathered data by befriending people, chatting to them, and eliciting responses from them, and used this with no disclosure to the participants, and used this and published that study. Okay, so that's something that, as you can imagine, some people would really think was not what you should be doing, ethically. Their argument was that if they were to disclose, they wouldn't get the right kind of data that they want, they wouldn't get the data, or they'd have people rejecting them and booting them out. However, Foxward and O'Rourke, a bit earlier actually, did the same sort of thing. It's pretty much identical really, but they used full disclosure, so they went in and asked if they could observe these discussions and interact with participants. And they generated high quality data which they found very useful. So the interesting thing about these is that they did the same thing, but one set of researchers decided disclosure was appropriate and the other it wasn't. I mean, having looked at the papers, I think it's fair to say that in the non-disclosed case the responses did seem to be of a different tone and nature. They seem to be less constructed for the research, perhaps a bit more candid. So there are arguments there. But another interesting one, actually, just to throw in there, is Tackett and Gibson, who decided that they should be disclosing their research to participants for ethical reasons. But when they asked to do this, the moderators of the group they were looking at, it was another pro-anorexia group, I think, said they didn't want them to disclose their presence as researchers, but allowed them to use the website data anyway. Their argument, the moderators, was that it would disrupt the group potentially. So they were happy for the data to be used and the unobtrusive, undisclosed research to take place, but they did not want the researchers to contact these participants and ask for consent. So we've got a range of different perspectives and ways of doing things here, and that's the kind of state we're in at the moment, really, with this issue on the private-public domain and whether you should get an informed consent from participants or not. Okay. So I've mentioned big data, and you saw the Nike Plus example. Well, what issues do we have about deciding which data we can and can't use? I talked about discussion groups, and then the main issue is, do you disclose or not your intentions? But other types of data may be less sensitive. People mentioned the distinction between normal and sensitive data earlier. You know, what about the kind of data about structures and processes? So people's web searches, well, that involves content. But let's say friends networks, who's friends with who, which isn't really sensitive content for data about your feelings or beliefs about anything, or you know, it's just kind of network, more structure and process data. Maybe that is more justifiable, that we could use that without gaining consent from participants, and actually gaining consent would be particularly difficult for many of those data sets. Well, one issue is that people may not be aware that their data is being saved in this way. So Google as people probably know, Google saves massive amounts of data and stores it and then sells it to anyone who's interested in using this data, and that will be search patterns and web browser activity. A lot of people may not be aware that their data is being stored in this way and that Google owns it. I think Google owns it anyway. I'm a psychologist, not a lawyer, but I believe that Google owns all that data. So the thing is that all these traces, the breadcrumbs of everyday interaction with the web, may be not apparent to the users who are leaving them there. And then we come back to the issue of the expectations of people about whether they want this data used. And you know, obviously, if we're considering ethics issues, we need to consider people's expectations, particularly going back to that core principle from the BPS code. So we have a duty as researchers, really, to understand what people know about what they're leaving as these traces. Certainly in my experience on the ethics committee at the Open University, there are some quite difficult cases where it's not quite clear. You know, people have different approaches and ideas about when data should or shouldn't be used. So it is an issue. We came up with some ideas, principles, ways to think about this issue, which is that when this is unclear and there are ambiguities about what people's expectations are and whether the data is public or private, the levels of harm potentially resulting from using this data is a key factor to assess and take into account. Okay, so more sensitive data, there's likely more risk of harm to emerge from collecting that data and using it. The scientific value of the research is another core factor that needs to be taken into account clearly, and there may be trade-offs that emerge here. The ability to keep the data anonymous, that is non-personal, when we go back to what Joe was saying about the Data Protection Act and those definitions, if that data is anonymous and cannot be traced to an individual, then we would have less concerns about harm arising from collecting that data. And a key principle that we came up with that permeates all these considerations in relation to different ethics principles that we're trying to apply is to implement ethics procedures and safeguards in this online environment which are proportional to the levels of risks of harm. So that's a key principle we came up with. Assess the risks of harm, looking at things like how identifiable is that data, and then look at what principles can be implemented to reduce those risks as far as possible where they seem quite high to start with. So clearly non-anonymous data is going to be more problematic than fully anonymised data. Legal considerations, I've been told we had someone with legal expertise on the working party that is developing these guidelines, and it seems that the copyright for any online material remains with the author or the web service provider, so Facebook owns all the Facebook content. I think, yes, that's right. The next point is that, strictly speaking, being in the public domain means not being protected by copyright law. Okay, that's perhaps not so clear cut. But strictly speaking, apparently that is the case. Clearly, we are not saying, or we did not say in our guidelines that people certainly are using Facebook, online data from Facebook and Twitter and so on and so forth. So, strictly speaking, yeah, it's something that needs to be considered. If you're looking at someone's personal web page, for example, the issue of whether you need to get permission for that because it's protected by copyright becomes relevant, particularly there. Again, this is another one that I wouldn't mind some legal input on. It's a vague comment anyway, but under the Data Protection Act 1998, if someone finds their personally identifiable data is being used, such as their Twitter posts or Facebook posts, they likely have the right to stop these being processed. The likely bit, well, I suppose there's just always shades of grey in the law, and I don't know what factors influence that really, to be honest. But that is another thing which needs to be taken into account, particularly if you're collecting data that's anonymised, but then someone recognises their data, and then you're legally obliged to remove that data from the data set when you can't identify that person's data. You know, this could lead you into trouble if these kind of things aren't considered carefully. So yeah, that's some kind of ways that we've tried to think about and approach the public-private domain distinction, really. I'm going to go through some of these things fairly quickly because I know this presentation is going to be available afterwards, and so people can follow up these points and any links there. But in relation to confidentiality and anonymity, which is linked to the privacy thing, one of the key points that I think needs to be highlighted is the enhanced traceability of data and how this might be important in the dissemination procedures that researchers use. So in offline research, qualitative interviewers might publish quotes in journal papers, and that's quite a safe thing to do. They might paraphrase them if it's a particularly sensitive research topic. But online, publishing quotes, well, there's more and more activity which involves research papers being available online and accessible in the public domain anyway. But the key point here is that a research quote appearing in a published paper could quite easily be put into a web browser search as a search term, and then leads someone to the original context in which that posting appeared. Okay, so this raises all sorts of issues about the anonymity and confidentiality of data, certainly, and requires careful consideration, but might not be an obvious point that researchers would think about if it hadn't been pointed out. Email, as people probably know, is quite an insecure, non-secure transmission method, but many participants might not realise this. This leads to issues about how much we need to inform our participants about risks that they might well not be aware of. Traces on personal computing equipment. Someone taking a survey might not realise that when their spouse or another person who uses the same computer might be able to come and look at the traces of what they submitted in the survey or something like that. And this becomes particularly relevant where we're talking about surveys or data collection on, say, illegal behaviours, for example. So again, we come back to this idea of sensitivity of data, more sensitive data or legal behaviours and so on, is associated with the risks of harm that this kind of approach might throw up and needs to be considered. So again, we come back to the point about this proportionality, assess the risks and implement principles that address and reduce these risks as far as possible. And in some cases, it may be concluded that it just isn't appropriate to gather data online for certain research studies. Research with children is an obvious example, particularly on sensitive topics. The guidelines are available, by the way, on the Bps website if anyone's interested, and there's more detail on all of these points about the specifics of how to implement some of these ideas. Valid consent, well, that's something that does emerge as an issue that needs some kind of some careful thought in an online context, because it's not so easy to obtain consent online as it is offline. For various reasons, there's various things that emerge. I'm using the term valid consent because a lawyer on our ethics committee told us that we shouldn't be using informed consent because actually you can never gain informed consent, fully informed consent. So we started using valid consent, and that's what the BPS are using now in their documentation. So verifying characteristics such as age and sex or gender becomes difficult. You know, the internet, there's all sorts of people on the internet. If you have an open online survey asking for volunteers on a sensitive topic, you can't guarantee that you won't have underage participants. You may well have underage participants taking part, and just asking them to tick a box that says they're over 17, 18, whatever your requirement is, isn't enough. And that's much more of an issue than offline research context, even postal surveys where you're actually targeting individuals, you know, who you're sending the surveys out to. So there's various procedures which I haven't got time to go into here that can help overcome these issues and safeguard against getting people who want to lie about their age involved, for example. Of course, participants, and there's quite a culture on online browsing behaviour of just zipping through stuff and not reading it properly. So another thing to bear in mind is to make the consent process as clear and accessible as possible. So not too much information, not too little information, but to try and check that participants have engaged with the consent information and any key information you need to convey to them. Various techniques are possible, such as using checkboxes. And as I mentioned before, not all risks online are obvious, and researchers really need to weigh up the extent to which they need to convey these risks to participants, of which they might not be aware. So the potential data leakage. Okay, for example, did you know that if you take part in this interview, your quotes might be traceable to your original postings, or email not being a very secure method for, say, interview research. Lots of researchers have done email interviews. So those kind of issues are important. And again, the proportionality principle emerges. I've got to finish and wrap up in about 5 minutes. A few points in relation to withdrawal and debrief. There are issues here, particularly in online surveys. The online survey is really taken off as a method, and particularly with all these packages like SurveyMonkey is a very popular one. People have probably heard of Qualtrics. There's hundreds of them now, actually, and so many PhD students and master students and researchers are using online surveys to collect data. There's many advantages of that approach. But withdrawal and debriefing procedures, particularly withdrawal, can be a bit complex when using these types of online methods. So detecting withdrawal can be harder to do than certainly lab-based research or postal surveys. So if you're going through an online survey, a participant may get to page 6 of 10 and then close the browser and opt out and disappear. And you've got the researcher then has partial data, and there's no indication of whether that data can be used, whether the participant intended it to be used or not. And if you do use it when they didn't want you to use it, then that's not really good. But if you don't use it after they spent their time filling in those 5 pages and with their answers, that's also ethically could be problematic as well. So these kind of things are difficult, and again, it's about getting safeguards and procedures that will overcome these things. There's not much you can do about participants exiting by closing their browser, to be honest, other than provide an exit button and just urge them not to. I don't know any software that can tackle that issue. If they do that and they decide to go, then they do it. And so online surveys that deal with very sensitive topics or deception may just not be appropriate because of those risks that involves in not being able to debrief participants. And again, we have the principle of proportionality. There's various techniques and there's various guides out which can advise people on particular online data collection techniques. I don't really want to say much about data protection now because it's been well covered by Joe. I don't know much about the Data Protection Act. They found out more this morning. But basically the issue that came up in our Research Ethics Committee was this issue of storing data on non-EU servers, basically. So SurveyMonkey, I mentioned it earlier, data is stored on servers in the States by SurveyMonkey, and a lot of people are using that package, and a lot of our applications are coming in suggesting they were going to use SurveyMonkey. So we had a policy, actually, that IT had a policy that we couldn't do that for some time. And then I mentioned the Safe Harbour scheme, which is basically a scheme that American companies such as SurveyMonkey sign up to, which basically gives the assurance that the way they store data is in accordance with the Data Protection Act of 1998. And this is the Office of National Statistics webpage that explains why their use of SurveyMonkey is justified by them because of this Safe Harbour Act. And I'd be interested in other people's insights who have more ideas about that, because I know some research funding bodies don't accept that, apparently, I've been told. So I think there's ambiguities about that. But certainly now the Open University Ethics Committee is happy that with this statement and that the ONS uses it, our students can use SurveyMonkey as well. Very quickly, levels of control. Well, this, as I said, levels of control are reduced in any online non-proximal situation, and this has implications for scientific value, validity. You don't know if people are lying about their biosocial attributes, their gender, age, etc., and whether they're intoxicated or having a conversation at the same time as taking part in the study, things you don't want them to be, probably in most cases. So that raises scientific validity issues. But it also has implications for levels of harm and monitoring participants' reactions as they take part in your research study. So there's two important issues there, really. I just want to briefly flag up again the disruption of social structures, and that while it might at face value seem that it's not a good idea to go in and start collecting particularly sensitive data from online discussion groups such as small social support networks, for example, this issue of disrupting social structures might sometimes justify this approach, and has done by some researchers. That's the batteries are on there. I was at a seminar on data on internet data collection methods, and a PhD student mentioned to me, I forget which university she was at now, but she mentioned that she just had clearance from her ethics committee to go into a support group. I think it was bereaved parents support group, and non-disclosed gather data. I can't remember. I think she must have had to. Lurking wouldn't really work if it was a very small group, so she must have been planning to go in and take part, but not disclose that she's a researcher. And that was justified because of the potential harm to them of not of doing the disclosure, so that they might foster mistrust, for example, amongst the group, and it was important support group. So, you know, these are contentious, difficult issues. And just in the end, the overall principle that we work to is maximising benefits and minimising harm. That was the last principle of the core Bps Ethics Principles. This principle just seems to permeate the other principles, and we come back to that idea that we have proportionality, so that the risks, the assessed risks, must be considered, and then procedures must be implemented to be proportional to those risks. And trade-offs will be inevitable, and ambiguities will arise, and thinking is not optional. Thank you.